Vincent Kane didn't move at first when his phone rang at 3 in the morning, cutting through the silence of his Los Angeles penthouse like a knife through silk. He was known throughout California as the most dangerous man in the underworld, a businessman whose empire stretched from the ports of Long Beach all the way to the vineyards of Napa Valley. His network controlled everything that mattered: shipping, real estate, entertainment, and the kind of power that made politicians return his calls within minutes. But at 3 in the morning, phone calls meant only one thing: someone was about to die, or someone already had. Vincent stared at the unknown number glowing on his screen, his jaw tight with the kind of control that came from 20 years of building an empire on calculated violence and strategic patience. When he finally answered, his voice was cold and empty, the tone that made grown men confess their sins before he even asked a question. The voice on the other end wasn't one of his associates. It was a woman, breathless and terrified, speaking English with an urgency that made something dormant crack open in his chest, something he thought he'd buried 8 months ago when he signed divorce papers and watched the only woman he'd ever loved walk out of his life. "Mr. Kane, please, I need you to come right now. She's in labor. Your ex-wife, the baby is coming. I don't know who else to call. She needs you here." Vincent's world stopped. Time suspended itself in that moment between heartbeats, between breathing in and breathing out. Amara, his wife, his ex-wife, the woman whose absence had carved a hole in his chest so deep he'd stopped believing it could ever heal. She was in labor with his child, a child he hadn't known existed until 3 minutes ago, when a stranger's voice shattered every wall he'd built to protect himself from the pain of losing her. 8 months of silence stretched between them like an ocean. 8 months of pretending he didn't wake up reaching for her every morning. 8 months of telling himself she was better off without the darkness he brought into every relationship, every room, every life he touched. All of it was meaningless now because she needed him, and nothing else in the world mattered more than getting to her. Vincent was already moving before his mind fully processed what he'd heard. He grabbed his keys, his wallet, his gun, because a man in his position never went anywhere unarmed, especially not in the middle of the night, when enemies were always watching for moments of weakness. He was out the door of his penthouse before the woman on the phone finished giving him the address. His driver materialized from the shadows of the parking garage, always present, always ready, the kind of loyalty that came from years of mutual trust and generous compensation. "Cedars Sinai Medical Center, West Tower," Vincent said, his voice carrying that particular edge of controlled desperation that his driver recognized immediately. "Drive fast, but don't get us pulled over. We can't afford delays tonight." The city blurred past in streaks of streetlights and darkness as they navigated through empty Los Angeles streets. Vincent's hands were steady on his knees, but his heart was a war drum beating against his ribs with enough force to make his chest ache. Amara, his brilliant, beautiful, stubborn wife who'd left him because she believed lies that someone had carefully constructed to destroy them. He'd spent 8 months trying to prove his innocence, trying to track down the source of those photographs that showed him with another woman, photographs that had been doctored so skillfully that even he'd had trouble proving they were fake. By the time he'd gathered enough evidence to clear his name, Amara had already signed the divorce papers and disappeared from his life completely, leaving behind only silence and the ghost of what they'd been together. Now she was having his baby and he hadn't known. The thought made something violent surge through him, made his hands curl into fists against his thighs. How long had she known? Why hadn't she told him? Did she hate him so much that she'd planned to raise his child alone, erasing him from their lives completely, as if he'd never existed, as if what they'd shared hadn't been real and profound and worth fighting for? The hospital loomed ahead, all glass and steel and modern architecture designed to inspire confidence in medical miracles. Vincent was out of the car before it fully stopped, moving through the automatic doors with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside, without knowing why. The night staff recognized him instantly, or at least recognized power when they saw it, the kind of dangerous authority that couldn't be hidden behind expensive suits and controlled expressions. The receptionist's hands trembled slightly as she pulled up the records, her eyes darting between her computer screen and Vincent's face like she was afraid looking too long might turn her to stone. Amara Wells, Labor and Delivery, 5th floor, room 512. The words barely registered before Vincent was moving again, taking the stairs because elevators were too slow, his expensive Italian shoes silent on the polished concrete as he climbed 2 steps at a time. His mind raced with questions he had no answers for, questions that had haunted him through 8 months of hell. Why hadn't she told him about the pregnancy? How long had she known before deciding to keep it from him? Did she plan to raise his child without ever letting him know he was a father? The thought made his chest tighten with a mixture of anger and grief so intense it was almost physical pain. He reached the 5th floor and forced himself to slow down, to breathe, to remember that walking into that room like a hurricane would only terrify her when she was already vulnerable and in pain. The hallway was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the distant sound of a newborn crying somewhere in the maternity ward. Room 512 was at the end of the corridor, and through the small window in the door, Vincent could see her. Amara was bent over in obvious pain, one hand gripping the bedrail hard enough to make her knuckles pale, while another woman, black like her with worried eyes and protective body language, rubbed her back and murmured encouragement that Vincent couldn't hear through the glass. The sight of Amara hurting made every protective instinct he'd tried to kill come roaring back to life with the force of a tidal wave. She was more beautiful than he remembered, and he'd remembered her every single day for 8 months straight. Her natural hair was pulled back from her face in a messy bun, her brown skin glowing despite the obvious pain etched across her features, her body fuller now with pregnancy, in a way that made his breath catch because she was carrying his child, their child, and he'd missed every moment of it. Vincent pushed open the door quietly. Both women turned, and the expression on Amara's face when she saw him was everything he'd hoped for and feared. Shock and relief and something that looked dangerously close to hope, all mixed together in those dark eyes he'd memorized years ago, when he'd still believed love could conquer the kind of darkness he carried inside him. She whispered his name, like it hurt to say it out loud, like she'd been holding it inside for so long that releasing it into the world felt like tearing open an old wound. Vincent, you came. I didn't think you would. I wasn't sure if Maya could even reach you. The disbelief in her voice cut deeper than any betrayal, because of course he came. Did she really think there was anything in this world that could have kept him away from her when she needed him? You called, he said simply, moving to her side like gravity itself was pulling him there, like his body remembered the way even when his mind had tried to forget. Did you really think I wouldn't come? His voice was rougher than he intended, betraying emotions he'd locked away for 8 months behind walls of anger and hurt and desperate longing. Another contraction hit her before she could respond, stealing whatever words she might have said and replacing them with a gasp of pain that made Vincent's hands curl into fists, because this was pain he couldn't eliminate with money or threats or violence. This was biology and nature, and something completely beyond his control, no matter how much power he wielded in every other aspect of his life. The other woman, Maya, according to what Amara had said, stepped back slightly to give them space, though her eyes remained suspicious and protective as she watched Vincent approach her friend. Vincent found himself doing something he hadn't done in 8 months. He touched her. His hand came to rest on her lower back, where he knew instinctively the pain would be centered, applying firm pressure the way some distant memory suggested might help. Breathe through it, he murmured, his voice dropping to that soft tone he'd only ever used with her, the one that revealed the man beneath the monster everyone else knew. Just breathe, Amara. I'm here now, I've got you. The words felt inadequate for the moment, too simple for the complexity of what was happening between them. 8 months of silence and hurt and misunderstanding. 8 months of believing lies and living with the consequences of trust destroyed. All of it compressed into this single moment where nothing mattered except getting her through the pain. Amara's hand found his and gripped it with surprising strength as the contraction peaked and then slowly, mercifully, began to fade. When she could breathe normally again, when the pain had receded enough for her to think clearly, she looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "I should have told you. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if you'd even want to know after everything that happened between us." Vincent's jaw tightened, because that hurt more than anything else she could have said. 8 months ago, she'd believed he was capable of cheating on her, of destroying their marriage with infidelity and lies. 8 months ago, she'd walked away without giving him a chance to prove his innocence, without trusting him enough to question the evidence that had been so carefully manufactured to destroy them. But right now, with her hand in his and his child about to be born, none of that mattered as much as making sure she knew one fundamental truth. "I would always want to know," Vincent said, his voice low and intense, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You could have told me on the day you signed those divorce papers. You could have thrown it in my face as a weapon, and I still would have fought for this child, for you, for us. There is no version of reality where I wouldn't want to be here." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gesture so familiar it made her breath hitch because they'd done this 1,000 times before, back when touching each other had been as natural as breathing. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of pain and presence. Vincent stayed at Amara's side through every contraction, every moment of fear, every second she gripped his hand hard enough to leave marks on his skin. He welcomed the pain because it was nothing compared to what she was enduring. Nothing compared to the 8 months he'd spent in his own personal hell without her. Maya hovered nearby with water and ice chips and words of encouragement, but her suspicious glances at Vincent never quite disappeared, as if she was constantly evaluating whether his presence was helping or hurting her friend. When the doctor finally arrived, a competent woman in her 50s with efficient movements and calm eyes that had seen countless births, she took one look at the dynamic in the room and asked the question that hung in the air like smoke. "Are you the father?" Her tone was professional and neutral, but her gaze was sharp as she looked between Vincent and Amara, cataloguing the tension and the tenderness and the complicated history written across both their faces. "Yes," Vincent said before Amara could answer, his tone brooking absolutely no argument. "I'm the father, and I'm staying." Amara's eyes found his, wide and questioning, searching his face for something she desperately needed to see. Whatever she found there must have been enough because she didn't contradict him, just squeezed his hand tighter, as the doctor began her examination. The examination took longer than Vincent liked, and he watched the doctor's expression shift from routine assessment to focused concern. "The baby's heart rate is dropping," she said, her voice remaining calm, but taking on an edge of urgency that made Vincent's entire body go rigid with tension. "We need to prep for an emergency cesarean section immediately. This baby needs to come out now, and we can't wait for labor to progress naturally." The words hit Vincent like physical blows. Amara's hand tightened around his until he thought his bones might crack, her eyes filling with tears that spilled over and ran down her cheeks. "Is my baby going to be okay? Please tell me my baby will be okay." The desperation in her voice made Vincent want to tear down the walls of the hospital until he found a way to fix this, to bend reality to his will the way he bent everything else in his life, through sheer force of determination and resources. The doctor placed a reassuring hand on Amara's shoulder, her expression softening slightly. "We're going to take excellent care of both of you, I promise. This is precautionary, and we're catching it early." She turned to Vincent with an apologetic expression. "Dad, you'll need to wait in the waiting room while we prep her for surgery. We'll come get you as soon as she's in recovery." "No." The word came out flat and absolute, carrying the kind of authority that Vincent had cultivated over 20 years, of making men twice his size bend to his will. "I'm not leaving her. I don't care what your protocols are. I don't care what the rules say. I'm not walking out that door without her." The doctor opened her mouth to argue, clearly prepared to cite hospital policy and surgical protocols. But something in Vincent's expression made her reconsider her approach. She'd worked at Cedars-Sinai long enough to recognize real power when she saw it, to know when a battle wasn't worth fighting because the outcome was already predetermined. "Fine, you can scrub in and be present for the surgery, but you follow every single one of my instructions or security will remove you. Do we have an understanding?" Vincent nodded once, already moving toward the sink to wash his hands, already preparing himself mentally for what was about to happen. A nurse appeared with surgical scrubs and showed him how to properly put on the sterile gown, mask, and gloves. His hands were steady as he dressed, years of maintaining composure under pressure, serving him well even as his heart raced with fear for Amara and their child. The operating room was cold and bright and terrifying in its clinical efficiency. Amara was awake, but groggy from the epidural, her eyes tracking Vincent's every movement, like he was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become fluid and uncertain. He positioned himself by her head, one hand holding hers, the other gently stroking her hair with a tenderness that would have shocked anyone who knew him in his professional capacity. "I'm right here," he murmured against her temple, his lips brushing her skin through the surgical mask. "I'm not going anywhere, not now, not ever. You're going to be fine, our baby is going to be fine. I promise you that." It was a promise he had no right to make, a promise that defied medicine and fate and logic itself, but he meant every single word with a conviction that bordered on religious faith. The surgery happened behind a sterile blue drape that blocked Amara's view of her own body. But Vincent could see everything if he chose to look. He kept his eyes on her face instead, watching for signs of pain or fear, monitoring her breathing, being the anchor she needed in this storm of medical intervention and terrifying uncertainty. The doctor worked with steady hands and quiet efficiency, her team moving around her like a well-choreographed dance they'd performed countless times before. Then suddenly, impossibly, there was a cry. Not Amara's cry, but something smaller and higher and more furious than anything Vincent had ever heard in his life. The doctor lifted up a tiny, perfect, screaming human being, a girl with golden brown skin and a full head of dark, curly hair and lungs that worked absolutely perfectly, if her angry protests were any indication. "She's here," the doctor announced with a smile in her voice. "A beautiful, healthy baby girl." Vincent couldn't breathe. His chest felt too tight, his throat too constricted, his entire world narrowing down to this single moment where everything changed forever. The baby, his daughter, was whisked over to the warming table where nurses worked quickly to suction her airways and clean her off and perform all the mysterious rituals that ensured she was breathing properly and transitioning well to life outside the womb. Amara was crying, tears streaming down her face into her hair. "Is she okay? Vincent, is she really okay? Tell me she's okay." Her voice was desperate, filled with the primal fear of a mother who couldn't see her child and needed reassurance more than she needed air to breathe. "She's perfect," Vincent managed to say, his own voice rough with emotions he didn't have names for. "She's absolutely perfect, Amara. She's got your skin and my hair and the angriest little face I've ever seen." His attempt at humor fell flat because his voice cracked on the last word, betraying just how overwhelmed he was by the reality of what had just happened. The nurse finished her assessment and brought the baby over, carefully placing her on Amara's chest for skin-to-skin contact. 7 pounds 2 ounces, she announced cheerfully. Perfect APGAR scores despite the dramatic entrance. "What are you naming this beautiful girl?" Vincent looked at Amara, realizing they'd never discussed names because they'd never had the chance to discuss anything about this pregnancy. Amara's hands came up to cradle their daughter with infinite gentleness, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "Isabella," she said, "Isabella Kane, after my mother." Vincent's heart stopped at the sound of his last name attached to his daughter. Amara hadn't changed her name back when they divorced, and now she was giving their daughter his name without hesitation, without conditions, as if despite everything that had gone wrong between them, this was still his family. "Isabella Kane," he repeated, testing the words on his tongue, feeling them settle into his bones like they'd always been meant to be there. "It's beautiful. She's beautiful." The rest of the surgery passed in a blur as the doctor closed the incision and ensured Amara's recovery would be smooth. Vincent stayed by her side, one hand holding hers, the other gently touching Isabella's tiny fingers as she lay on her mother's chest, already calming down from her furious entrance into the world. Once everything was complete, and Amara had been moved to a recovery room, once the immediate medical concerns had been addressed and the nurses had finished their initial checks, Vincent found himself alone with his daughter while Amara slept. He stood by the window holding Isabella, who was now wrapped in a pink and white striped hospital blanket, her tiny face peaceful in sleep. She was so small in his arms, so impossibly fragile, so completely dependent on him for protection and provision and love. Vincent had held weapons and signed contracts worth millions and built an empire on calculated violence. But holding his daughter was the most terrifying thing he'd ever done in his life. "You're going to have everything," he whispered to her. his voice dropping into the kind of tenderness he'd only ever shown to one other person. Everything I never had growing up. Love and safety and a father who would burn down the entire world to keep you protected. Nobody is ever going to hurt you. Nobody is ever going to make you feel like you're not enough. And nobody is ever going to take you away from me. I promise you that, Isabella. I promise on everything I am. Isabella's tiny hand found his finger and wrapped around it with surprising strength for someone only minutes old. Vincent felt something inside his chest shatter and reform all at once, like his heart had been made of stone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to truly feel anything beyond anger and ambition and the cold satisfaction of power. But this small being had cracked him wide open, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would never be the same man he'd been before she existed. Before we hit the 1,000 subscribers, we need to keep bringing you these stories. Can you do me a favor? Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, would you have shown up at 3 in the morning for your ex? What would you have done in Vincent's position? Your answers always blow me away, and I read every single one, because this community is what makes these stories come alive. Amara stirred in the bed behind him, pulling Vincent's attention away from his daughter and back to the woman who'd given her life. He turned to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between wonder and regret and cautious hope. "You're natural with her," Amara said quietly, her voice still weak from the surgery and medication. "I've had 8 months to prepare for this, 8 months to read every parenting book and take every class and imagine every possible scenario. But you just walked in here and knew exactly what to do with her. How is that even possible?" "Because she's mine," Vincent said simply, the words carrying a weight of conviction that left no room for doubt. "Ours. I've been reading about babies since the week we found out you were pregnant the first time. Before the divorce, before everything fell apart. I wanted to be ready when the time came." The admission hung between them, revealing just how much he'd invested in a future that had been stolen from them both. Amara's eyes filled with fresh tears, and Vincent carefully transferred Isabella back to her mother's arms before sitting on the edge of the hospital bed. The question he'd been holding back since the moment he walked through that door finally forced its way out, raw and painful and necessary. "Why didn't you tell me, Amara?" 8 months. You carried our daughter for 8 months and never once reached out. Did you hate me so much that you wanted to erase me from her life completely?" The pain in his voice was unfiltered and vulnerable, the kind of emotion he never showed anyone, because vulnerability in his world was a death sentence. But this was Amara, and she'd always been able to see through every wall he built, every mask he wore, straight down to the broken places he tried to hide from the rest of the world. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after I signed the divorce papers," Amara said, her free hand reaching for his. 2 weeks after I'd convinced myself that you'd destroyed everything we built together, that you'd cheated on me and lied about it, and made me feel like a fool for ever trusting you. And then suddenly there was this baby, this piece of you growing inside me, and I didn't know what to do with that reality." She took a shaky breath before continuing. "Part of me wanted to call you immediately and tell you everything. But the other part, the part that was still bleeding and broken, was terrified you'd reject us both, that you'd think I was trying to trap you or manipulate you or use the baby to get your money. So I convinced myself it was better to handle it alone, to protect Isabella from the possibility of having a father who didn't want her." Vincent's jaw tightened with barely controlled emotion. "I would never reject my child," he said, each word precise and weighted with absolute certainty. "Never. Even if you'd told me while we were signing those papers, even if you'd thrown it in my face as some kind of weapon, I would have fought for this baby, and for you, and for us. There is no universe where I wouldn't want to be Isabella's father." "I know that now," Amara whispered, more tears falling. "But then in those first few weeks when everything was still so raw, I couldn't see past my own pain. And by the time I'd worked through enough of it to consider reaching out, too much time had passed. I convinced myself you'd moved on with your life, that you were better off without the complication of an unplanned child tying you to a woman who'd walked away." "Moved on?" Vincent's laugh was bitter and broken. "I haven't moved on, Amara. I haven't touched another woman since the day we met. Haven't wanted anyone else. Haven't been able to think about anything except proving those photographs were fabricated lies, designed to destroy us. 8 months of living in hell, because the only person I've ever loved was gone, and I didn't know how to get her back. His hand came up to cup her face with heartbreaking gentleness, his thumb brushing away her tears. There is no moving on from you. There's only surviving until you come back to me. And now you're here and we have Isabella, and I'm not letting either of you go ever again. Amara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as if she could somehow absorb his certainty through physical contact alone. I'm sorry, she breathed. I'm so sorry for not trusting you enough to question those photographs. Sorry for believing the worst instead of fighting for the truth. Sorry for keeping Isabella from you. Sorry for all of it. Vincent kissed her forehead with infinite care, mindful of her exhaustion and the pain she must still be feeling from the surgery. We're going to fix this, he said firmly. All of it. Whatever it takes, however long it takes. We're going to rebuild what was broken, because I refuse to lose you again. I refuse to lose her. His eyes dropped to Isabella, sleeping peacefully between them. You're both mine, and I protect what's mine with everything I have and everything I am. The door opened softly, and Maya entered with coffee and a cautious expression that suggested she'd been deliberately giving them privacy. She set the cups down and studied Vincent with less hostility than before, though her protective instincts were still clearly engaged. Are you really planning to stick around? She asked bluntly, her tone making it clear she wouldn't accept anything less than complete honesty. Because Amara has been through absolute hell these past 8 months, and if you're just going to disappear when reality gets complicated, it would be better if you left right now before Isabella gets attached to having a father around. Vincent met her challenging gaze without flinching, his voice carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow. I'm not going anywhere, Vincent said, his tone leaving no room for doubt or negotiation. Not now, not tomorrow, not ever. This is my family and I'm going to take care of them. Whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, I will do it. That's not a promise I make lightly, and it's not one I break. Maya's expression softened fractionally, though her protective stance remained. Good, because that little girl deserves a father who actually shows up, and Amara deserves someone who fights for her instead of running when things get messy. She picked up her jacket and headed for the door. I'm going to grab some real food and let you two figure things out. Try not to make any more babies while I'm gone, okay? The comment made Amara laugh despite her exhaustion, and Maya winked before slipping out and closing the door softly behind her. The room fell into comfortable silence, just the three of them breathing together, a family that was broken finally beginning to heal. But the peace couldn't last forever, because Vincent's world had never allowed peace to exist for long. His phone vibrated in his pocket around dawn, pulling his attention away from watching Isabella sleep in her bassinet. The message was from his second-in-command, 3 words that made his blood run cold. Crisis. Office. Now. Vincent looked at Amara, who was finally sleeping peacefully after hours of discomfort, and made a decision that went against every instinct he'd cultivated over 20 years. He wasn't leaving. Whatever emergency had erupted in his absence could be handled by his team, or it could wait until he was ready to deal with it himself. But his phone rang again 30 seconds later, and the name on the screen made his jaw tighten with tension. Derek Morrison, his most trusted lieutenant, the man who'd been managing operations while Vincent was at the hospital. He stepped into the hallway and answered in a voice that could cut glass. This better be life or death, Derek. It might be, boss. Derek's voice carried the kind of controlled urgency that meant someone was definitely about to die. We've got chatter from multiple sources. Your rivals know you're vulnerable right now, distracted with personal matters. They're positioning for a coordinated strike against your territory. I don't have all the details yet, but the timing is too suspicious to be coincidental. Vincent's mind immediately shifted into the cold, calculating mode that had kept him alive and in power for 2 decades. How did they find out where I am? Who talked? The question was delivered in a tone that promised severe consequences for whoever had leaked his location. We're investigating, but you need to understand how this looks from their perspective. Derek's voice dropped lower. You disappeared in the middle of the night without explanation. You're at a hospital with your ex-wife, and you're not responding to business communications. They see weakness, and weakness in our world is an invitation to strike. Vincent's hands curled into fists as he processed the threat, He couldn't leave Amara and Isabella vulnerable and exposed in a hospital where anyone could walk in. But he also couldn't let his empire crumble, because he was focused on personal matters, no matter how important those matters were to him personally. "Double security at the hospital immediately," he ordered. "Nobody gets on this floor without my explicit approval, and send Christina to me within the hour. I need her assessment of the situation." Christina Hayes arrived exactly 53 minutes later, a sharp woman in her mid-40s who'd been Vincent's head of security for 12 years. She'd saved his life 3 times, had orchestrated countless operations, and was one of the handful of people he trusted completely with sensitive information. "Boss," she said by way of greeting, her eyes already scanning the hospital corridor with professional assessment. "We've got a serious situation developing." "Tell me something I don't already know," Vincent muttered, running a hand through his hair in rare display of frustration. "What's the intelligence saying?" Christina pulled up information on her tablet, her expression grim. 3 different organizations are making moves against your holdings. They think you're distracted and vulnerable because of the divorce, because you've been less visible lately. They don't know about the baby yet, but they will soon, and when they do, that information becomes a weapon they can use against you. Vincent's entire body went rigid. "Nobody touches my family. Make that absolutely clear to everyone in our organization, and everyone who might be listening on the outside. Anyone who even looks at Amara or Isabella wrong disappears permanently. No warnings, no second chances, no mercy." "Understood, but there's something else you need to know." Christina hesitated, which was unusual because she never hesitated. "One of the organizations making moves is being led by someone with a personal grudge, someone who definitely knows about Amara and might have been involved in manufacturing those photographs that destroyed your marriage 8 months ago." Vincent went very still, his voice dropping to a whisper that was infinitely more dangerous than shouting. "Who?" "Richard Castellano, your former business partner." Christina's words landed like bombs. "The man you cut out 7 years ago for embezzling funds and betraying your trust. He's been building alliances in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back at you where it would hurt the most." Vincent's vision narrowed as rage flooded through his system, cold and focused and absolutely lethal. Castellano. He should have eliminated him permanently when he had the chance instead of showing mercy, instead of simply removing him from the organization and letting him walk away with his life. Now that misplaced mercy was coming back to threaten everything he loved. "What's his play?" Vincent's voice was deadly calm, the tone that made seasoned criminals confess their sins without being asked. Christina swiped through more intelligence reports on her tablet. "He's been meeting with someone from Amara's past, an ex-boyfriend who has his own reasons for wanting revenge. Richard Castellano, your former business partner," Christina said quietly. "The man you cut out 7 years ago for embezzling funds. He's been building alliances in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And he's working with someone from Amara's past, an ex-boyfriend named Jordan Mitchell, who has his own reasons for wanting revenge against both of you." Vincent's blood ran ice-cold at the mention of Jordan's name. He knew exactly who Jordan Mitchell was, a controlling narcissist who'd made Amara's life miserable for 2 years before she finally found the courage to leave him. Vincent had dealt with Jordan quietly 5 years ago when he'd tried to contact Amara after their wedding, had made it clear that approaching her again would result in consequences Jordan wouldn't survive. Apparently, Jordan had found new allies and a renewed appetite for revenge. "Get me everything on both of them," Vincent ordered, his voice deadly calm. "Every communication, every movement, every person they've contacted in the last 6 months. And Christina, I want them alive for now. I need to know exactly what they've been planning and who else is involved before we move." Christina nodded and disappeared to coordinate the intelligence gathering. Vincent returned to Amara's room to find her awake and nursing Isabella, her face soft with maternal love that made his chest ache. She looked up when he entered, and her expression immediately shifted to concern. "Something's wrong. I can see it on your face." "What happened?" Vincent sat beside her on the bed, careful not to disturb Isabella. "There's been a threat against me and my organization, and it might extend to you and Isabella. I need to move you somewhere safer than this hospital, somewhere I can control who has access to you. Fear flashed across Amara's face, but she held his gaze steadily. Who would target us? We're divorced. I'm not part of your world anymore, Vincent. You're the mother of my child, Vincent said gently. That makes you part of my world forever. And there are people who would use you to hurt me, who would threaten Isabella to force my hand in business dealings. I won't let that happen. We're leaving within 2 hours. I have a secure location prepared where they can't touch you. Amara's hand tightened protectively around Isabella. What about my apartment, my things, Maya and her job? Everything will be taken care of. Maya can come with us if she wants, or I'll arrange separate protection for her. But Amara, this isn't negotiable. Your safety and Isabella's safety are the only things that matter right now. His voice softened with desperate urgency. I know you're scared. I know you don't want to be pulled back into this life. But please trust me one more time. Let me protect you both. The raw fear underneath his controlled exterior convinced her more than any argument could have. She nodded slowly. Okay, we'll go. But Vincent, you have to promise me something. Promise me you're not going to do anything that gets you killed. Isabella needs her father and I need you. The confession hung between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Vincent cupped her face with both hands and kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. I promise I'm coming back to both of you. We're going to get through this together, and when it's over, we're going to fix our marriage and raise our daughter and be the family we should have been from the start. He pulled back to look into her eyes. I love you, Amara. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day in 8 months. I should have said it sooner, should have fought harder, but I'm saying it now. I love you with everything I am. Amara's eyes filled with tears. I love you too. God, I never stopped either. Even when I thought I hated you, even when I was signing those divorce papers and convincing myself I'd be better off alone, I loved you through all of it. Vincent kissed her then, carefully because she was still recovering, but with enough intensity to leave no doubt about his feelings. When they broke apart, Isabella had finished nursing and was staring up at them with wise, dark eyes. She has your eyes, Amara whispered, stroking their daughter's cheek. And your determination, if the way she fought her way into this world means anything, then she's going to be unstoppable, Vincent said with a rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually hard features, just like her mother. The following weeks were a blur of security measures and careful planning. Vincent dealt with Castellano and Jordan swiftly and permanently, dismantling their alliance before it could become a real threat. The details of what happened to them never reached Amara, and she never asked because some things were better left unknown. What mattered was that the threat disappeared, and Vincent came home to them every night, whole and alive and increasingly devoted to being the father and husband he'd always wanted to be. 6 weeks after Isabella's birth, Vincent and Amara stood together in a small chapel on his estate in Malibu, with Isabella sleeping in Maya's arms and a handful of trusted friends as witnesses. They exchanged new vows, better vows, promises built on truth and trust and the hard-won knowledge that love was worth fighting for, even when the world tried to tear it apart. This time, Vincent slipped a ring onto Amara's finger, with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. This time, Amara said her vows without doubt or fear clouding her certainty. This time, when they kissed as husband and wife, their daughter was there to witness the beginning of everything they'd almost lost. If you've made it this far in our story, you're part of something special. This community, you beautiful people, are the reason I get to keep creating these stories that I hope touch your hearts the way they touch mine. So, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and down in the comments, tell me your story. Have you ever gotten a second chance at love? What would you do if someone from your past called at 3 in the morning? Your stories inspire me, and I read every single one. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember that sometimes the best love stories are the ones that survive being broken and find their way back together.